Howdy mates, how are we doing today? Here's a part 2 video over at the Wildflower Preserve. So I'm exploring another part of this park that I figured would be worth checking out. We're actually on top of a little bit of a mound right here. Now, rest assured, I am led to believe that it is a natural, or a man-made mound, pardon me. So, and given that this was also a golf course for the longest time. But this particular video, I wanted to really focus upon how we can provide stewardship in our water bodies here. In terms of like, how can we help improve water quality? And I figured it was most befitting, given that we are close to a marsh. So here we go. So we begin. So really, one of the principles that is really applied at this park is the incorporation of native plants, right? So some native plants that I am seeing, right away include the Biden's alba, right here. But then, of course, once you get a bit closer to the water, you'll start to see more of like the broom sedge, black needle rush, and even pickerel weed. Those are more of your native varieties. Now, typically, whenever you have native plants that border along a wetland, a marsh, you name it, those native plants have an ability to use nutrients, which are typically in the form of nitrates and phosphates. Now, really the difference with nitrates and phosphates is usually the source. So typically phosphates are commonly found in cases such as soil, bedrock, even. Phosphate mining was, and still is, a huge operation in this state. And then for another, nitrates, on the other hand, usually comes from agriculture. Nitrates commonly come from sources such as animal waste. However, those sources of both nutrients, that's not all of it, of course. Those are just a couple of examples. Another way that we can actually help improve our water quality is to actually have our septic tanks inspected. Because sometimes what can happen is if we, say, have a leaking septic tank, we may inadvertently be releasing nitrates into our soil without really necessarily knowing. Now, for another, it never hurts to pick up after your dog or pet. Fortunately, at this park, pets aren't allowed. So that's another method that you can use. And another good way, which is also being incorporated here, is to remove debris. So when you are removing debris, whether it be vegetation or even from buildings, you're allowing proper water flow to occur so that the water is constantly replenished. But here's one thing that I will say. One of the issues with nutrient pollution does indeed come from our soil. Now, there is a term that I want to bring up with you guys. Now, I'm not going to go too in depth with it because it is quite of a concept, but this term that I speak of is something known as the cation exchange capacity. Now, what that refers to is it's essentially it's the soil's ability to retain nutrients. So, soil in general has anions and cations. Simply put, ions are simply atoms that have a charge to them. Anion is an example. That refers to a negatively charged ion, whereas a cation is positively charged. Usually some common sources of anions, in soil include nitrate and phosphate, which are both nutrients that come in contact with oxygen. Now, on the other hand, some examples of cations found in soil include potassium, magnesium, and even ammonium. Now, the thing is, the cation exchange capacity has a particular limitation depending on the soil type. It usually ranges from 0 to 100, and it's usually measured in mill equivalents per 100 grams, I believe. Yeah, I'd be sure to actually put the correct metric in the description. Anyway, what happens is, with a lot of our fertilizers that contain those nitrates and phosphates, you're putting in more anions than the cations that are in the soil. So, given that sandy soil, especially Florida's, has a much lower cation exchange capacity, once the negatively charged nutrients, or the anions, outweigh the cations in the soil, there will be a result of leaching, in which case further nutrients are being released. Think of it this way. Essentially, you can't have more than 100% of something. So when you put in more nitrates and phosphates than what the soil can carry, the cup of water becomes overfilled. That's a metaphor. And so that really leads to the nutrient pollution issue. At least that's part of it, of course. And that also gives rise to the issue of the red tide. So that being said, some of these measures that I discussed is incorporating native plants, and definitely when you are fertilizing, don't do it by a body of water, or else it has plenty of opportunity, the excess, to make it into our water. So that's another thing too. Follow your regulations for how much is allowed, where and when it should be applied. So that way, then you're taking the proper steps of reducing nutrient pollution. Alright, you guys, I'll be sure to provide a couple of links in case if any of you have more curiosity as to the depth of these concepts that I've mentioned. All right, take care, you guys. See ya.